Hello, BookTube. It's time for Chapter 8 of William Harris Arnold's Ventures in Book Collecting, published in 1923 by Charles Scribner's and Sons, that is. And Chapter 8 is entitled My Tennysons. Everybody knows that Poems by Two Brothers is the earliest book containing verses by Alfred Tennyson. Alfred was 18 and Charles was 20 when J. and J. Jackson, printers of Louth, the market town nearest to Lincolnshire, home of the Tennysons, arranged with the brothers to publish a selection of their poems and actually paid them in cash and books, the equivalent of £20 for the doubtful privilege. A few poems of the eldest brother, Frederick, were included. What induced the Jacksons to enter into this unbusinesslike engagement does not appear. Moreover, with amazing assurance, these country printers produced the book in two sizes, an ordinary edition priced at 5 shillings and a large paper edition at 7 shillings. There was no high degree of merit in any of the poems, and none of them have been included in the authorized editions of the writings of the poets. In later years, Tennyson spoke of his large share in the book as early rot. Of course, there was no sale to speak of, but for the boys it was a time of rejoicing. Alfred and Charles, Frederick was at Cambridge, celebrated the day of publication by hiring a carriage with some of the money the Jacksons had paid. They drove to the seashore 14 miles away and shared their triumph with the winds and waves. Today, £20 would not buy one single copy of Poems by the Brothers, as issued in its simple covers of drab paper boards and paper label. The original manuscript is now one of the treasures of Trinity College, Cambridge. And there is a facsimile of the title page. The next year, 1828, both Alfred and Charles matriculated at Trinity. There, they soon became leaders of the literary group of aspiring students. A relic of this period, now in my possession, is a classical atlas which belonged to Alfred, and has his name written in the white lining of the front cover. Also in his delicate hand, on the inside of the back cover, is a list of classmates, doubtless the sympathetic intimates of the young poet. Here, among a score of names, we find Merivale, who became Dean of Ely, and the distinguished historian of Rome, Milnes, later Lord Houghton, the first biographer of Keats, Selwyn, afterward Anglican Bishop of New Zealand, Buller, who gained fame as a liberal statesman, and Hallam, brother poet, and best beloved. The subject for the English prize poem at the University of Cambridge for the year 1829 was Timbuktu. Tennyson was the successful competitor. In accordance with the custom, the author would have read the poem in the Senate House, but then, as in later life, he had an aversion to all publicities, and by request, his friend Merivale relieved him of the distasteful honor. Timbuktu and Greek and Latin poems by C.R. Kennedy and Charles Merivale were officially printed at the University Press under the title Prolusinis Academic. The pamphlet, though scarce, is not a rarity. When catalogued by booksellers and auctioneers, the Latin title is often ignored and only the contribution of Tennyson mentioned. Of course, this distinction is due to the great interest in Tennyson. Otherwise, the pamphlet is of no importance. The existence of a separate print of Timbuktu, bearing the same date as the Prolusinus, was unknown to collectors until about 20 years ago, when a single copy came into the market. It was bought by Albert J. Morgan of New York City, and at the subsequent dispersal of Mr. Morgan's collection, I secured this treasurable brochure. My Tennyson collection already contained several extreme rarities, the despair of many collectors. Now was added the earliest separate print that bears the name of Alfred Tennyson, presumably a unique copy. But in such a matter, you can never tell. Years later, Winston Henry Hagen of New York put in a bid of $25 at Anderson's for what he supposed was the Perlucinus, although the auction catalog made mention only of Timbuktu. It happened that several weeks passed before Mr. Hagen examined his purchase. He was surprised to find it comprised only the Tennyson poem. Mr. Hagen, never having heard of the little-known separate print, naturally inferred that the thin octavo was probably a defective copy of the Perlucinus. To resolve his doubts, he took the pamphlet to Beverly Chew, one of the best informed of book collectors. Mr. Chew immediately identified it as a twin to my copy. Since this find was made, another copy is turned up in England, and it is now in the possession of Thomas J. Wise. The Hagen copy, now in the extensive Tennyson collection of John A. Spoor of Chicago, and mine are without covers, and the edges are plain. Mr. Wise's copy is in original dark crimson, stiffened papered covers with gilt edges. The separate Timbuktu was printed from the standing types of the Perlucinus. Probably only a few copies were struck off by request of the young author for distribution among his friends. The existence of this separate issue of Timbuktu is now well known to collectors and dealers, and there has been no lack of effort in the search for other copies, but so far only the 3 here mentioned have been discovered, and he has an asterisk for a footnote, quite an extensive footnote. Unfortunately, the Perlucinus is open to juggling manipulation. The Timbuktu portion, which has an individual title page, may be easily detached. More than once, in my knowledge, the Tennyson poem, thus removed from the original pamphlet, has been offered for sale as the rare separate issue. However, such examples may be easily identified. The title page of the poem, as printed in the Perlucinus, reads Timbuktu on a line, a poem, next line, which obtained the Chancellor's Medal of the separate line Cambridge commencement, and then date 1829 by A. Tennyson of Trinity College. There is no imprint. The title page of the separate issue is the same as the foregoing, but has in addition the arms of the university and this imprint printed by J. Smith Printer to the University 1829. Also, the title page is preceded by a half title which has on it only the single word Timbuktu. There are also minor differences in the spacings of the text, but enough has been said to enable anyone to identify a pseudo separate issue. And here is a title page of the separate actually issue with the date and the university. Excuse me. As we continue with the normal text, Tennyson was but 21 when he had the manuscript of his first volume of poems ready for the printer. Returning home one night from a neighboring town, he lost the precious sheets from his overcoat pocket. They were never recovered. Though it seems an almost incredible feat, the young man actually rewrote all the lost poems from memory. 600 copies were printed by Effingham Wilson under the title Poems Chiefly Lyrical. The price was 5 shillings. The poet received £11 as his share of the proceeds. My copy, in the original drab paper boards, has this pleasing inscription: Mary Green, from her affectionate friend A.T. 2 years later, another volume was printed, this time by Edward Moxon, who was destined to publish for Tennyson for many years. The edition was only 450 copies, nearly all bound to drab paper boards. Mine happens to be one of the few in cloth of the same shade. Though issued in December 1832, the date on the title page is that of the following year, so the usual designation of the volume is the Poems of 1833. A letter to Moxon of considerable bibliographical importance in relation to this very book is printed, apparently without abridgment, in Alfred Lord Tennyson, a memoir by his son. Actually, only half the letter is given. Here it is in full, copied from the original in my collection. Dear Sir, after mature consideration, I have come to a resolution of not publishing the last poem in my little volume entitled Lover's Tale. It is too full of faults, and though I think it might conduce towards making me popular, yet to my eye it spoils the completeness of the book and is better away. Of course, whatever expenses may have been incurred in printing the above must devolve on me solely. The volume can end with the piece titled to J.S. Half of this last I have received in revise. There are 9 stanzas more which it will not be necessary to send me. If I remember right, they only contained one material blunder, viz. Bleeding for bleedeth. Should this last revise be already on its way, it will be better for me to retain it. And if there is any other mistake, which is scarcely probable, I will give you notice by letter. We who live in the corner of this in this corner of the world only get our letters twice or thrice a week. This has caused considerable delay, but in the receipt of this you may begin to dress the volume for its introduction to the world as soon as you choose. Believe me, dear sir, yours very truly, Alfred Tennyson. P.S. The title page may be simply Poems by Alfred Tennyson. Don't let the printers squire me. Be so good as to send me 5 copies. In this volume first appeared many of the poems which have secured enduring popularity. The Lady of Shalott, Marina in the South, The Miller's Daughter, The Palace of Art, The Lotus Eaters, The Dream of Fair Women, and The May Queen. Although Tennyson decided not to publish The Lover's Tale, he had 6 copies of the poem separately printed. 5 of these were given to friends of the young poet. The single copy retained was cut to pieces by Tennyson 36 years later, in preparing copy for another trial edition, much revised and enlarged. The poet was not content with this second effort, for the first published edition, again revised, was not issued until 1879. When in 1907 Thomas J. Wise, after years of diligent research, printed his exhaustive bibliography of Tennyson, he was able to record the existence of only 2 of the original 6 copies of The Lover's Tale. One of these in his own possession, the other in the collection of John A. Spoor. So much effort has been made by collectors and dealers in the search for this important rarity, it seems unlikely that any more would be discovered. But a few years later, a copy turned up in Southampton and was secured by a firm of London booksellers who offered it to Ernest Dresel North, the veteran dealer in rare books. Then on one of his frequent book-hunting visits to England, Mr. North had a long-standing request from Charles Templeton Crocker of San Francisco to report at once should he ever come upon this particular rarity. Thus Mr. Crocker had the exceptional satisfaction of adding the much sought-after little book to his notable Tennyson collection. On a certain bleak night early in the year 1920, my wife and I were ensconced in our after-dinner chairs, one on each side of the open fire, a veritable Darby and Joan. Several book catalogues had come in the mail of the day. I began with an unpretentious one issued by Edward Howell of Liverpool. The first page did not hold my attention, but the turn of the leaf made my eyes pop, for there, in big type, was unmistakably described, one of the missing copies of the original trial edition of The Lover's Tale, the price absurdly low, £20. I immediately telephoned the Western Union and gave a cable order. As I afterward learned, 16 American collectors cabled Mr. Howell. We were all too late. The little volume had already been bought by the most alert booksellers in all England, who quickly sold it to another eager collector. Nevertheless, the identical copy of the book now fills the long empty gap in my collection. How it came into my possession more than a year later is a secret. I can only say that I am a very lucky book collector. And there is the title page for Lover's Tale. In 1842, had many in 1842. Tennyson had many more poems ready for publication. These, with selections from the earlier books, many of them revised, were issued in 2 volumes. The edition of 800 copies was sold in a year, so Moxon brought out a second edition of 1,000 copies. In the succeeding 10 years, 6 more editions were required to meet the steady growing demand. Tennyson's business relations with the publisher were also highly satisfactory. The two men so soon became friends as the invitation for a weekend visit attests. Mount Pleasant, Eastbourne, Sussex, and the letter begins, "My dear Moxon, could you find time to come and see me next Saturday? There is a coach every other day all the way to Eastbourne, and on those days when the coach does not run, if you come to Brighton by the forenoon train, you will find a coach hitherward at 1:30. Answer me if you can by return of post, or maybe if you don't come I shall flit. Beachy Head is worth mounting. I shall write to Lawrence by this post to come down with you, and you may have a companion. You will arrange it together. Yours, ever yours, A. Tennyson." The Lawrence who was to accompany Moxon was doubtlessly Samuel Lawrence, the artist, who painted a portrait of the poet in the early days. A reproduction of it is in the frontispiece of the first volume of Hallam Tennyson's memoir of his father. Edward Fitzgerald thus speaks of the painting. "Very perfect as Lawrence's portrait is, it is nevertheless the best painted portrait I have seen, and certainly the only one of old days. Blubber-lipped, I remember once Alfred called it. So it is, but still the only one of old days, and still the best of all to my liking." And there's the there's the portrait in question. In my collection is another letter to Moxon, which speaks of the next poetical flight, the greater portion of the new poem that had been written at Lincoln's Inn Fields. "Mablethorpe, Alfred, Lincolnshire. My dear Moxon, I find that I shall not be able to get away for a fortnight. I am putting the last touches to the Princess. I trust there will still be time when I come up to get the book out by Xmas. I shall be at this place for about 10 days. If any letters arrive, send them on here. Ever yours, A. Tennyson." Tennyson's desire was gratified. The Princess, a medley, came out in November 1847. The first edition was 2,000 copies. Another issue was required in 1848. 2 years later, much of the poem was revised for the third edition, in which first appeared the 6 intercalary songs that so greatly added to the fame of Tennyson. I have an original manuscript of 5 of these lyrics written by the poet before publication on a single folded sheet of notepaper. Each song differs more or less from the published text. At the bottom of the last page is the remark signed A.T. These are not written regularly, but just as they turn up. The 5 lyrics of the manuscript are: "The splendor falls on castle walls, as through the land at eve we went. Home they brought her, warrior dead. Ask me no more, and thy voice is heard through rolling drums." There is a marked difference between the manuscript and the published text. In the first 2 lines of the last mentioned lyric, instead of the printed form, the voice is heard through rolling drums that beat to battle where he stands. We have in manuscript, "When all among the thundering drums thy soldier in the battle stands." At the end of the manuscript verse is a trumpet blare, "Tara ta tantera, tantera, tara ta tantera." This was omitted on the publication. The lacking song is sweet and low. Probably it had not yet been written. Whenever I show this precious sheet, I tell a little story relating to one of these familiar lyrics, which expresses the poet's dry humor. An aspiring citizen of our great country wrote to Tennyson requesting an autographed signature and sentiment. He received no reply. The man again wrote, repeated his request. Still there was no reply. The persistent one made a third effort. This time came a response, here reproduced from the original. A Tennyson sentiment, ask me no more. And there is the autograph. Tennyson first met Emily Saulwood when he was 21. She was 17, a lovely girl of much charm. Emily was walking at the time with Arthur Hallam in the fairy wood of Somersby. To Alfred, she appeared like a light across the woodland ways. He said to her, "Are you Dryad or Oread wandering here?" After his first meeting, they saw little of one another for 6 years. Then the young poet escorted the fair one, a bridesmaid at the wedding of her sister Louisa, to Alfred's brother Charles. From that day, friendship quickly ripened to deep affection, but after 3 years, as they seemed to be no prospect of marriage, Alfred's income being too small for the greatness of all ventures, communication between the lovers was forbidden. There was 10 long years of separation before the engagement was revived. This was in the spring of 1850. In June, the patient pair were happily made one. This mid-century year was the great year for Tennyson. During the very month of nuptial festivities, in Maranum was published and greeted with general acclaim. Edward Moxon, his publisher, agreed to pay a small annual royalty. The office of Poet Laureate, made vacant by the death of Wordsworth, had been tendered to Samuel Rogers, who declined it on account of his advanced years. The post was then offered to Tennyson. Following time-honored custom, the new Poet Laureate planned to attend one of the Queen's levees. Learning that Tennyson was searching among his friends to find the required form of dress for the occasion, Rogers came to the rescue. I have a letter in my collection written shortly after the function in which Tennyson says, "You will have seen that I kissed the Queen's hand on the 6th. Rogers lent me this court dress, and very same that poor Wordsworth had worn. I hate all publicities, and so was a little bit nervous, but got through very creditably." Tennyson and his bride began housekeeping in the village of Warringland, Sussex. But one night a storm blew through part of the wall of their bedroom, and through the gap the wind raved and the water rushed. Moreover, they now learned that the dining room and their bedroom had been a Roman Catholic chapel, and that a baby was buried somewhere on the premises, and later that a notorious thief and murderer had once made the house his home. The nearest doctor and butcher were 7 miles away. Altogether, these traditions and conditions were too much for the newlywed. So they soon moved to Twickenham, where they found comfort and convenience. After 2 years, the Tennysons again decided to seek a new domicile. In a letter I have that was written to his friend Flowers, it appears the task was not an easy one, for the poet says, "I am so eager to fly about the country in this wretched house hunting business, now in Sussex, now in Gloucestershire or Yorkshire, that I never can be sure of my whereabouts a day beforehand." At last the permanent home was found in Farringford, situated near the village of Freshwater on the Isle of Wight. A few miles away lived Sir John Simeon, highly esteemed by the poet as critic and friend. About this time, Maud was begun. The poem was first printed in what Mr. Wise calls a prenatal edition, of which no copy can now be traced. Fortunately, one which had been sent by Tennyson to Coventry Patmore, in order that the latter might have an opportunity to prepare an earlier and well-considered review was seen by Mr. Wise before Patmore destroyed it in accordance with Tennyson's injunction to burn or return. A subsequent proof of the poem uh, was seen by Richard Hearn Shepherd, who compared it with the text of the first published edition. Shepherd removed the cloth covers from copies of the published books and inserted blank leaves between the printed pages. On these blank pages, he transcribed the many lines of the proof that differed from the published text. The books thus treated found ready sale to collectors and students, as they afford the only available text of the early mod. In the summer of 1904, a few books from the library of Sir John Simeon, then deceased, were sold at auction at Sotheby's. Two of the items were thus described: Maud and Other Poems, original proof sheets of pages 1 to 128, first edition, unbound, 1855. Maud, etc., another collection of odd proof sheets, 1855. On the possibility that these sheets might have an extraordinary interest, I made venturesome bids which happily secured them. When they arrived, my attention was so taken by a certain item of recognized importance which came to me from the same source, and to which I shall refer later in this chapter, that I gave little consideration to those fragments of Maud, and owing to other distractions, more than a year elapsed before I examined them carefully. I was indeed delighted when I found that, while these proof sheets do not form a consecutive copy, they do comprise overlapping proofs which embrace the complete text of Maud, in which are not only all the lines that the errant shepherd surreptitiously copied, but also several lines and many verbal variants hitherto unknown. Thus my risky bids brought to me a series of sheets, the only examples known, which include the earliest existing text of Maud. In a letter in my collection written by Tennyson to his brother-in-law Charles Weld, there is an allusion to the new poem. I received the other day a most flattering letter from Ruskin, touching poor little Maud. I am glad that you too find something in her. It is a poem written in an entirely new form, as far as I know. I think that properly to appreciate it, you ought to hear the author read it. And this I say not in vanity, but that to give effect to the long sweeps of meter, you must have a reader who not only reads somewhat dramatically, but likewise has a full voice and ample lungs. The published volume bears the title Maud and Other Poems. Of these other poems, the most important are The Brook, Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington, and The Charge of the Light Brigade. The famous battle ballad was written in a few minutes. Tennyson's emotions at the time were revealed to us not only in the poem itself, but also in the letter I now have, which was written shortly after the fatal charge. My heart almost bursts with indignation at the accursed mismanagement of our noble little army, that flower of men. No other poem of Tennyson has been subjected to as many revisions. It was first published in the Examiner. The original galley proof, now in my possession, bears noteworthy alterations in the poet's hand. As a matter of interest to all admirers of the poetry of Tennyson, I wish it were feasible to give these changes in detail, but to do so and to show other changes written by the poet on the subsequent page proof, also in my possession, could only be satisfactorily done by reproducing those in earlier proofs entire. The limits of space forbid this indulgence, so we must be content with a few manuscript lines on a separate sheet which differ materially from the galley proof. Agree word for word with the limits of space forbid this indulgence, so we must be content with a few manuscript lines on a separate sheet which differ materially from the galley proof. Agree word for word with the page proof, and again differ from the poem as it appeared on publication in the Examiner. This bit of manuscript is now in my collection. plunged in the battle smoke, plunged in the battery smoke. Fiercely the line they broke, cassock and Russian, reeled from the saber stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back as before they rode onward, half a league back, but not the 600. After publication, the poem underwent more changes. Altogether, the revisions and reversions, altogether the revisions and reversions of themselves would afford ample material for a separate chapter, restricted to the story of this immortal ballad. And there is the manuscript for those stanzas. Another letter from my collection, though written many years later, must have place here. It already has been printed, but unfortunately with errors of transcription. Dear sir, I cannot attend your banquet, but I enclose £5 to defray some of its expenses, or to be distributed as you may think fit among the most indignant of the survivors of that glorious charge. A blunder it may have been, but one for which England should be grateful, having learned thereby that her soldiers are the bravest and most obedient under the sun. I will drink a cup on the 25th to the health and long life of all your fine fellows, and thanking yourself and your comrades heartily for the cordial invitation sent to me. I pray you all to believe me now and ever your admiring fellow countryman, A. Tennyson. The project for the poetical rendition of the Arthurian legend was entertained by the poet for many years. It found its first expression in The Lady of Shalott, which appeared in the poems of 1833 and was followed in 1837 by St. Agnes, and in 1842 by three more lyrics, Sir Galahad, Sir Lancelot, and Queen Guinevere. The 1842 volumes also contain Morte d'Arthur, which later became part of the Passing of Arthur. The Arthurian scheme was broadened in scope when 15 years later Tennyson had his printers produce trial copies in folded sheets of two epics under the title Enid and Numai, or the True and the False. These were sent to critical friends with injunction to return to the author. Only 3 of these trial copies are known to have survived. One was presented to the British Museum by Francis Turner Palgrave. One was bequeathed with other books to South Kensington Museum by John Forster, and one discovered among the books of Sir John Simeon many years after his decease, was sent by Lady Simeon in 1904, and a few other volumes from Sir John's library to be sold at auction. This was the certain item of recognized importance which came to me from Sotheby's in the same package with the fragments of Maud already described. The trial copy of Enid and Nimue is still in the state in which it came from the printer, and it is unbound, and the folded sheets of each poem stabbed with and separately tied by cord. The title page is lacking. Doubtless it had not yet been printed when the proofs were sent to Sir John. There are few minor alterations in the text in Tennyson's hand. 2 years later, 1859, 2 more Arthurian poems, Elaine and Guinevere, were ready for the printer. A few trial copies, which also included Enid and Nimue, were struck off under the title The True and the False, 4 Idols of the King. Of these trial books, only 2 copies remain. One of them is in South Kensington Museum. How I obtained the other, the earlier of the 2, has been elsewhere told. It will now suffice to say that this Tennyson Rarissima, obscurely catalogued by the English dealer in the second-hand books, became mine for a few shillings. The title of the second idol, Nimue, was changed before publication to the more euphemous Vivian. The published volume containing the 4 poems bears the ever familiar title Idols of the King. 10,000 copies were sold in the first week. In the spring of 1920, a few manuscripts and books which had been withheld by many years ago, the Rofant Library was sold were sent to Sotheby's to be auctioned. The most important of these was a manuscript in Tennyson's hand of Nimue. The closely written sheets of note size are bound in paper boards in the first leaf of this inscription, F. Locker from Tennyson. I was the successful bidder for this and 3 of Tennyson's books which bear similar presentation inscriptions. Each of these 3 volumes was important manuscript additions to the poet's hand. Locker, for his own purposes, had printed a sumptuous catalogue of his Rochefort library. My sensations of early collecting days while reading his descriptions of these very same presentation volumes are still vivid. Even the possibility that they might one day become mine did not then enter my head. But undreamed of treasures are the reward of the patient collector. The little row of first editions has grown and grown until it is now the most important Tennyson collection on this side of the Atlantic. The continued popularity of the Idylls of the King had an effect in the first issue of the title for the next issued volume of Tennyson's poems. This was Idylls of the Hearth. Why the charming designation was discarded does not appear. It was a stop press change. Not only had proof after proof been paused back and forth between author and printer to the extent of apparently 9 revises in folded sheets, but also a few completed cloth-bound copies had been distributed, all bearing the felicitous title. Of the 9 revises, the only one in my collection is the 4th, as is indicated by the Roman numeral 4 written at the top of the title page, where are many corrections in Tennyson's hands, especially the Northern Farmer, Old Style. The Yorkshire dialect would be a stumbling block to any printer. The new name, so hurriedly adapted, was the colorless Enoch Arden, etc. My copy of the first published edition was presented to the wife of Reverend William Henry Brookfield, fondly called Old Brook by his inmates. As is well known, Mr. Brookfield was a brilliant woman of rare charm who drew into their circle of friends nearly all the London literary group of the mid-Victorian period. This volume bears the inscription, Jane Octavia Brookfield, from A. Tennyson. We hear little in these days of the notion of the climatic, which maintains there are critical periods or turning points in human life, which occur when certain multiples of 7 years are attained. Thus, the ages of 21, 35, 49 are endowed with unusual importance, and at 63 years, one reaches the grand climacteric. But be that as it may, Tennyson may be cited in testimony of the validity of the supposition, though he had never before written a drama other than one boyish attempt in the decade following his grand climacteric. He wrote no less than 6 poetical: Queen Mary, Harold, Becket, the Falcon, the Foresters, the Cup, and one in part prose, The Promise of May. Last of the series of 5 of these dramas, the exceptions being Queen Mary and Harold. Small special editions were printed in advance of publication for the use of the author. I have fine copies of 4 of these early issues. Of the Foresters, only one trial copy has survived. This lone example is owned by Mr. Wise, whose Tennyson collection excels all others in interest and extent. It is no part of my purpose to refer in these notes to each of every edition of Tennyson, and I have unmentioned several of the very scarce privately printed issues. There is, however, one more rarity as yet lacking in my collection that I wish to speak of. The poem Early Spring was published in the Youth's Companion of December 13th, 1883. As Mr. Wise tells us in his bibliography, the poem was also printed in London in pamphlet form, simply in order to assure the English copyright, and 6 copies only were produced. Although not published until 1883, Early Spring had been composed at least as far back as 1834, for a manuscript written in that year is still in existence. The poem, in its original form, it consisted of 9 stanzas, of which 4 only are identical, and these not verbally so, with the 8 stanzas printed in 1883. Some years ago, I spent a very merry Christmas in Boston. In one of the few intervals of relaxation from hilarity, I find myself in the little stone steps that almost drop one into the alluring basement bookshop of Godspeed in Park Street. I had had happy business relations with Mr. Godspeed for many years. Often he had written to tell me of recently acquired book or a letter of the sort that I was interested in. This time I said to him, "When you have something important, especially if it be a Tennyson item, do not write to me about it, but send the book or autograph itself. If I don't want it, I'll send it back without delay." Within about a fortnight after this visit, I received a rather large, thin parcel with the Godspeed label. It contained the manuscript of Early Spring, written on a folio sheet as sent to the Youth's Companion in 1883. Following the poem, which is signed by the poet, is the message dated March 12th, 83. "Gentlemen, my father begs to send you this new poem of his for your Youth's Companion. He has copied it out for you and hopes that you will like it. I am, yours faithfully, Hallam Tennyson." Of course, Hallam Tennyson was not aware of the fact that the poem was not wholly new, but was a radical revision of the unpublished verses of half a century earlier. While I am still in the lookout for the little pamphlet, I can most truly say that I am not the least bit envious of those fortunate collectors who have acquired the very rare separate print of this charming poem. One more manuscript is to be mentioned. In 1868, Tennyson built a summer home on the Blackton, Surrey, and named it Aldworth. Here, in his 80th year, he wrote the little poem, "The Roses on the Terrace." An early draft of these lovely lines is pasted in the scrapbook of autographs, which eventually was once a possession of the member of the Tennyson family. The manuscript has slight variations for the printed form. Apparently, Tennyson transcribed the poem, making 2 or 3 verbal changes, and then tore the original sheet into 3 pieces, for whose preservation we are indebted to the owner of the scrapbook. Below the poem has been attached a signature, probably cut from a letter, and the poem in the manuscript reads, "Here on the terrace 50 years ago, when I was in my June and you in your May, 2 words, my rose, set all your face aglow, and now I am white and you are gray. That blush of 50 years ago, my dear, lives in the past, but close to me today, as this red rose upon the terrace here glows in the blue of 50 miles away. A. Tennyson." And there is the manuscript and the signature there. Now, it's taken a while. That's the end of the chapter, but I just wanted to make a brief note regarding, he mentions Thomas J. Wise several times, and in the introduction is written by Thomas J. Wise, and this was published, Arnold died in 1923, so this was came out after his death. Now, and about 10 years after that, Thomas J. Wise was exposed as a bit of a fraud. In 1934 it was. And here's the book that was done. It was by John Carter and Nicholas Barker. Now, he forged a lot of items, and there is a section in here that references Arnold. It says the provenance of the copies in the anonymous sales, which must represent about 2/3 of the total, is now impossible to discover, as none of the auctioneers seem to have preserved their ledgers, nor does the acknowledged ownership of copies in England help to indicate any possible alternative source of supply. Mr. Wise wrote, referring to his discovery as a bundle of the reading sonnets that were bought by Henry Buxton, Foreman Robert Alfred Potts, Sir Edward Goss, and Reverend Stopford Brooke. and many others. So he was selling uh, like a lot of stuff through auctions. And then it says the American collections in which the forgeries were most strongly represented before the war appeared to have been those of William Harris Arnold, and the three Tennysons were apparently duplicates. And he goes on and on. Um, and then he says it must be added to other collections here. But it says here, he quotes here Miss Arnold in page 14 in this book. And that was Amy read that, the introduction by Wise, and chapter 1. I'll leave a link to that as well. But he says, through the kind offices of my new, but now dear old friend and distinguished collector and bibliographer, Mr. Thomas J. Wise, I obtained one Tennyson rarity after another, most of which were at the time unknown to American collectors. Of course, because they were forgeries. Or a lot of them were, not all of them, but they were forgeries. So I was going to do something on Thomas J. Wise, but it is such a big subject, and I don't know the details as much as I should. But it just goes to show that in a lot of these books where they talk about these manuscripts at the time, there could be some forgeries in there that turn out later. So it's kind of thing you almost need an annotated version of this, somebody to go through and nitpick and trace down every book that he references, which is a big job. But anyway, yeah. So his good friend sort of stuck him with fakes several times. So I'm not so sure you call him a good friend, actually. But anyway, that's it, BookTube. I'll be back next Sunday with chapter... what is it? So that's chapter 8, 9, 10. I think that's getting near to the end. I think that might be the last chapter. Chapter 10 is the last chapter. It's quite big, so it might have to be split in two. But anyway, till next time, BookTube. Thank you.